My name is Rachel Leggett. I'm a senior web applications developer to talk to you about improving website performance. So in my role, I build custom web applications for faculty, administrators, lab centers, and academic departments. And let's get going. So today we're going to start by it even matters that your site is fast. We'll move into a case study. We'll talk about how WordPress development, and then we'll summarize what we've learned. So a 2019 Microsoft study found that 162 million Americans lack broadband internet, particularly in rural areas, and that's nearly half the US population. And of course, that's just in the US, and that could potentially be worse around the world. So with COVID having forced a lot of people to and increasing remote work, folks are just increasingly distributed around the world, and it's no longer plausible to think that everyone accessing our university content is going to be within campus and like on a fast university connection. Even some of my coworkers who work in the office with me in Ann Arbor, who are now working from home, only have access to spotty satellite internet just 25 minutes outside of Ann Arbor. So it's even a problem that's close to home. And I thought Tim Wright in his talk yesterday on end-to-end accessibility testing made a great point that access to information is access to truth. So not only does do our websites have to be accessible in that way, if they're slow or they don't load at all and slow connections, they're just as inaccessible. And also it's better for business. Faster websites are going to have lower bounce rates, for one thing. So not everyone has access to high-speed internet, and faster sites make for a more equitable web. So let's move into our case study. So one of the apps I work on is the Software Management Interface, or SMI. It's a Python and Flask app. And it displays information about what software is available for students, for faculty and staff to use, and what limitations there are in that use, such as whether it can be used on a virtual machine, whether it can be used for commercial research. Kind of a good kicker in this day and age is whether it can be used outside of 50 miles from campus. And this web app or website was always a bit slow, but no one really complained because for the most part, everyone was accessing it from like a university connection. But about a year ago, my team started allowing everyone to telecommute 1 day a week or work from home 1 day a week. And on slower home internet, even on broadband, even like fast home broadband, it was painful how slow this site was because nothing was as fast as a university connection. So on one of my more frustrating work from home days, I decided to run a Lighthouse test to see how bad it was. So if you're unfamiliar, Lighthouse is a tool that is provided by Google Chrome. It's available in the Chrome developer tools, and it allows you to run several different types of audits on your site. I use it for performance testing and for accessibility testing. And so on this performance test that I ran, I have a screenshot here on my site showing that our score was 26 out of 100. I actually sometimes saw scores of as low as 0 out of 100, depending on whether, on where I ran the test, like on what page in the app. And some of the highlights of this very poor result are that it was taking 7.6 seconds until the first meaningful paint, or the first time that any actual like useful content showed up on the page, and then 8.8 seconds until it was interactive. So over 8 seconds until a user could actually use the page. So clearly that is not acceptable. So we took a two-pronged approach to trying to fix this issue. We started with back-end optimizations, and we looked for inefficiencies in code, and we refactored them. We moved on to front-end optimizations after that, where we reduced the number and size of imports. And then we're not done yet, so our next steps are to continue trying to reduce those file sizes and limiting dependencies. So Lighthouse suggests great front-end improvements. They provide documentation on, or there's links to documents on things like what is a render blocking resource, how do I limit it, stuff like that. But I knew there were issues with the backend code too, so I wanted to start there. So I asked one of our student employees, who was a freshman computer science student at the time, to evaluate the app and make suggestions for backend performance improvements. He submitted a write-up explaining that the app had to rebuild its database model from our MySQL database on every page load, the way it had been coded. And so we use a library called Flask SQL Alchemy to query our database. And that's actually, so rebuilding the database model on every page load is not how that's supposed to work. That was a bug in our code. But then in addition, we were not leveraging Flask SQL Alchemy to kind of its fullest extent. So we were writing raw SQL queries, but Flask SQL Alchemy actually has an object relationship mapper implementation, or ORM, which can make it more developer friendly to interact with the database through your app, and more efficient. It handles joins very efficiently. So kind of a quick overview of how an ORM works, and specifically how the Flask SQL Alchemy ORM works. On the right side of my screen, I have a screenshot of one class from our model. It's basically we're declaring a class. In this case, it's intent review defaults. It's inheriting from the database model. And we're telling it, okay, this corresponds to the table name in our database of intent review use case allowed default. We're telling it that it has a composite primary key consisting of all 3 of its columns, which is a database design decision that I was not a part of, and you can take it up with other people I work with. I've also taken it up with them. But anyway, so we're specifying those primary key constraints, and then we're listing out, okay, what are the actual columns in this table? Are they foreign keys? Are they primary keys? What type are they? Maybe they're a string or an integer or a date time. And then something that's not shown in this example that's really great about this ORM is that you can also specify how tables relate to each other. So from that angle, it makes it really convenient to access a table maybe like 2 steps away in a relationship. So it's more developer friendly that way, and then it really efficiently handles joins. So it was a lot of boilerplate to get this ORM set up for our entire application. It was really worth it. That student and I worked together on refactoring this part of it for several months, and I would say that got us about halfway to our optimization. So next, we tackled opportunities for improvement on the front end. As I mentioned, Lighthouse provides fantastic suggestions here, and we decided to focus on reducing the number and size of our imports. One thing Lighthouse called out to us was that we had too many render blocking resources. So we were importing too many things, and those things were too big, and they were all trying to be loaded before the page could load anything. So that's why we were seeing like 7 seconds before anything was showing up on the page. So one way we tried to address this was using more built-in HTML and HTML and JavaScript functionality. So we rewrote much of the JavaScript to use modern ES6 methods instead of relying on jQuery and jQuery UI, with the goal of eventually removing both from the app altogether. We also leveraged built-in HTML elements. So one example of this is throughout the admin side of our app, we have a whole bunch of date pickers all over the place in a bunch of different forms. And we were building those, we were using jQuery UI for those date pickers. So just quickly, a date picker would be, I have a screenshot to the right of my to the right of my slide with a sample date picker. Essentially, you have a field. You can click in that field, or maybe you click on a little calendar icon or something, and it brings up a calendar that you can kind of scroll through and select what date you want. And then once you select that date, it properly formats the date and enters that date into your field. So the screenshot I have on this slide is actually Chrome's native implementation of the HTML input type equals date. But we were completely like re-architecting this using jQuery UI. So we switched to using that built-in HTML element instead. And that is actually supported on every modern browser. And we were able to completely remove jQuery UI from our app because we didn't need it for that date picker anymore. And it turned out we were importing that entire library just for date pickers. And then as for replacing jQuery with plain JavaScript, a lot of the reason that jQuery kind of became popular when it did was that it used like less code to do the same things that plain JavaScript would do. So it used to be harder in plain JavaScript to get, for example, an element by its ID or an element by its class, or adding a class or removing a class, for example. And jQuery added functionality that made it really easy to do that. But these days, JavaScript also has that same functionality built in such an easy way. So the example I have on my slide is that you can use document.getElement by ID to get an element by its ID. You don't have to do everything you used to have to do. So jQuery for most applications it's kind of overkill at this point. And it's such a big library, we don't want to have to import it. So we started doing that. We're not done replacing jQuery yet, but we've made great progress. We also started removing as much unused CSS as possible. We don't want to be importing a big file that we're only using a third of. We now minify and bundle all of our CSS and JavaScript into just 4 files. So minifying would be removing all the white space. In some cases, minification will also maybe rename like a long variable to use a shorter name, so it's taking up less space, less like text in your file, I mean. And for that, we used a Flask library called Flask Assets. And we have an admin CSS file. We have an admin JavaScript file. We have a public CSS file and a public JavaScript file, where that bundling part of it is combining all of those minified files into just those 4 files. And then we're loading only the admin files on the admin side and only the public files on the public side. So the reason that's so important for our app is that we have this whole admin interface that has a ton of stuff on it that isn't used on the public side at all. So that way we can save a lot of load time on the public facing side. And it's kind of okay if the admin folks have to wait a little bit longer. But these optimizations did speed up the admin side too, I have to say. So after all those optimizations, we're now achieving a Lighthouse performance score of between 63 and 97 out of 100. So on the left here, I have a chart called Performance Score Comparison. It's a column chart. On the left side of that column chart, we have a column that's labeled Before Optimization, which goes up to 26 out of 100. And then on the right, we have a, excuse me, we have a column that is 2 columns stacked. The first bottom section of it is the mobile score of 63, and then above it, we have the desktop score of 97, where it all adds up to 97. So we have a range where we were getting 26, now we're getting 63 to 97. And the reason for the discrepancy between the mobile score and the desktop score is that Lighthouse simulates a flaky 3G connection for the mobile audit. So I actually place more stock in the mobile score than the desktop score because my goal is for folks with low speed connections to be able to use my site. But it's kind of nice to see that 97. It's a little bit of like a vanity pat on the back. Like, yeah, we did a good job. But obviously we're not done. So with that mobile score of 63, we're still seeing a 3.9 second wait for a first contentful paint, which is like 50% better than before we were getting, what was it, like 7.6 seconds. But over 3 seconds is still way longer than I would like. But we've made progress. So we still have opportunities for improvement. I want to finish replacing the remaining jQuery dependencies. And I want to look into paginating results or implementing a load more option for pages that have a lot of results that take a long. We have some pages, especially on the admin side, where they're showing data of, it's like every software package that has ever been offered for student or faculty use over the last 5 years for every version and every operating system offered in our computer labs. So you can imagine that even with all of these optimizations in place, those sorts of pages take a really long time to load. But there's no reason that they need to load all of that data at one time. So I want to look into mitigating that. So I learned a lot in that case study, and you can definitely apply those same sorts of approaches to WordPress. So you can go for a minimal just-in-time approach. You can use available tools to mitigate slowdowns from third-party themes and plugins, and you can optimize your images, which is something we haven't talked about yet because there were absolutely no images in that web app. So focus on a minimal just-in-time approach. Try to remove bloat and unused code. You can focus on removing large dependencies and using micro libraries to accomplish only what you need and not more. So what I mean by a micro library is if you are, say there was a compelling reason that we needed some sort of custom functionality or custom something in that date picker. Instead of importing all of jQuery UI to do what we wanted to do, we could write a small bit of JavaScript that does only what we need to do. Or maybe there's a tiny library out there that does only what we need to do and not more, and we can import that. So that's what I mean by a micro library. You can bundle and minify where possible. So like I mentioned, I used a Flask library for that, but there are other kind of more popular options out there. Webpack is big. I know Gulp was popular in the WordPress community for a while. I get the impression it's not as popular anymore. And then Snowpack is maybe another one that's newer, another one to look into. And then you can load only what you need and only when you need it. So for example, try not to load every script in the header. Try to only load the things that you need on pages. Don't load extra things. And then load asynchronously where possible. So one thing that's hard to avoid when using WordPress, and this is of course WordPress itself, not using WordPress in like a decoupled architecture, is that third-party themes and plugins often load CSS and JavaScript where it isn't needed. So that's going back to that idea that if you only need some CSS on one page, only load it on that one page. But plugins are often loading it on every page. So I use a plugin for this that I would recommend. There are both free versions and versions, and I do have links to both in these slides if you wanted to go back later and take a look. I use the free version, and it's not an ad. I am just a fan. So Hummingbird comes with several tools, and the one I find most helpful is Asset Optimization, which is available in the free version. So on my slide here, I am displaying a screenshot from one of my personal websites, which only uses third-party themes and plugins, and for which I have not done any custom coding. So Hummingbird runs an audit of your site's performance and files, and then Asset Optimization allows you to minify, exclude files, force them to load after the content, force them to load asynchronously, and move CSS inline. And it works with both CSS and JavaScript files. So one thing that Hummingbird doesn't do is it doesn't make suggestions of what to do with those files. So you do have to think. Well, we're getting near the end, so hopefully it'll last. Are you seeing my?
Yes.
All right, you ready for me to continue?
By all means, go ahead. Uh-oh. I suppose you didn't hear that.
Files force loading after the... Oh, sorry?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, please.
Okay. So asset optimization allows you to minify, exclude files, force them to load asynchronously, and move CSS inline. And it works with both CSS and JavaScript files, but it doesn't make suggestions of what to do. So you definitely have to think carefully about what a file is being used for by looking at its name, looking at its content, etc. And also, I recommend refreshing your site regularly to make sure you don't break anything, and definitely try to do it on a staging site first. So in this screenshot, it's just a small sample of the files that are on that personal site I mentioned. But here I have minified 2 theme files. I have moved an icon style sheet to load in the footer because that icon style sheet is only loading one tiny icon in a search bar, and I don't care if that loads after the content. And I'm completely excluding 2 Jetpack style sheets that I don't need. Because I have Jetpack installed and activated, and I'm only using it for widget visibility. And those 2 style sheets have nothing to do with widget visibility, so I do not want them loaded on my page. So I've found this tool very helpful. Another thing you use for big speed improvements, if you've ever waited for a large image to load or waited for a ton of images to load, you know that images can be a big deal. But there are things you can do. So you can make sure your theme properly supports WordPress's responsive image implementation. And so when you upload an image to WordPress, WordPress automatically generates a bunch of sizes of that image. And then when you add that image somewhere into your site, it adds the src set and sizes, attributes, and values to that image tag, which is basically telling the browser which image size to load for which screen size. And then you can further customize those breakpoints by extending the WP calculate image sizes filter. And I do not have that filter listed here on this slide, but if you look up how this works, I'm sure you can find it. I also recommend using a CDN. A CDN is a content delivery network, which is a geographically distributed group of servers that work together to provide fast delivery of content. I use Cloudflare, which I think has amazing free features, including a CDN, as well as caching and DDoS attack mitigation, which is a good security bonus there.
Doing it live, and if there's an issue that will pop up, it will always pop up. That's quite all right.
Okay. Alrighty. Did you hear me talk about CDNs?
Yes, I'm checking the captioning, and that's about where the stream cut out for you. Was right, and towards the end, after you defined what a CDN was. Once you went to your next sentence, I believe that's when it dropped out.
Okay, thank you. So my last point about CDNs was that I like to use Cloudflare, which I think has amazing free features, which includes a CDN, caching, and also a security bonus, DDoS attack mitigation. So another thing you can do to optimize your images is to serve WebP images where possible. It's currently supported in new versions of Chrome, Firefox, Edge, and Opera. For Safari, it's not currently supported, but it has been pushed into the preview version of their next release. And then it's not supported in IE, so you do have to kind of mitigate that. But WebP is a modern image format with great compression. WebP lossless images are 26% smaller than PNGs. And if you are okay with lossy compression, you get even more of a benefit. And then WordPress doesn't actually let you upload WebP directly, so you do have to use a plugin, and I have a recommendation that I'll discuss soon. Finally, you can lazy load your images, which means only loading your images as they are needed. So if you have, say, a long news article with images throughout it, your user doesn't need to wait for, or shouldn't need to wait for, the images at the end to load. So what lazy loading how it's usually implemented is that only the images in the viewport will load, and then as the user scrolls, the images that are coming up into their screen will load. And I found out yesterday from Francesca Morano's talk that lazy loading has actually been merged into the release candidate for WordPress 5.5, which is coming in just a few weeks in August. So you could test that today if you wanted to. So if you have work for image optimization, I do have a no-code recommendation for you. I like the Smush plugin from WPMU Dev. There is also, again, a free version and a premium version, and I have links to both in my slides if you want to go back later and check that out. I use the premium version of this one because the premium version comes with WebP support with the CDN, and that's actually a pro feature of Cloudflare, and it's cheaper annually to do a premium subscription to Smush than it is to do a premium subscription to Cloudflare, and I've been happy with the WebP support that Smush Pro provides, so I use that. And I'm still just a fan, still not sponsored. Darn. So in addition, if you are building a headless WordPress site, oh, actually one more thing about Smush, sorry, that handles for you serving WebP on only supported browsers. So you wouldn't have to worry about like, oh, what if my users are using Internet Explorer? All right, so if you're building a headless WordPress site, there's some additional things you can do. So if you're not using a static site generator, I definitely recommend caching your data and limiting your number of API calls. But I also recommend considering using a static site generator. So to talk briefly about what that is, so you're probably familiar that WordPress builds each page on demand, fetching content from the database. So each page is assembled kind of when someone visits it, when they request it from the server. But usually sites only change when there's a change to the content or the design, and that's not happening all the time. So static site generators build static files, so like your HTML, your CSS, and JavaScript files, and they just rebuild when something changes. And so it's always those static files that your visitor is requesting when they come to your site, which leads for very fast performance in most cases. So if you're curious about this and you missed Steve Persh and Rachel Cherry's talk yesterday on the 5 Ws of decoupled websites, I highly recommend going back and watching that recording when it becomes available. It's a fantastic deep dive into kind of one implementation of this. And they used Gatsby, and some popular options include Gatsby, 11t, Hugo, and Nuxt. Hugo is a Go framework for static site generators, but the rest are JavaScript. I think Gatsby's React, Nuxt is Vue, and 11t is probably just plain JavaScript. And there's a whole bunch of other options too. So there should hopefully be something that's right for you if this is the way you want to go. And then if you are using a static site generator, you might want to look into an image optimization plugin. I know that Gatsby Image for Gatsby is popular, and I've heard good things about Cloudinary, although I haven't tried it myself. And then, of course, accessibility should never be an afterthought. And refactoring and or optimizing a web app is a great chance to double check your site's accessibility. As you touch things, I would recommend taking a little extra time to make sure those things are accessible. So 2 examples for you. When I update input, I also checked all labels on my inputs for all of those forms to make sure that they met WCAG 2 standards. And then when you're optimizing your images, that's a good time to make sure those images have descriptive alt text. Because it's much easier to work on accessibility as you go. So in summary, I refactored the backend of my Python and Flask app to use an ORM. I minified and bundled JavaScript and CSS files, removed unused CSS, and rewrote jQuery dependent functionality to use plain JavaScript and HTML, which cut down on import size. And that brought our performance score from 0 to 26 to 63 to 97. And you can apply those lessons learned to WordPress development. You can focus on a minimal, just-in-time approach to serving assets like scripts and images. You can optimize images by using responsive images, WebP, a CDN, and lazy loading. You can use no-code tools like Hummingbird and Smush if you want to. And for headless WordPress, without a static site generator, you can cache and limit API calls. And with the static site generator, you're going to see vast speed improvements as well. And then, of course, check for accessibility at every step of the process. So on my final slide here, I have my Twitter handle and my email address if you had any questions or want to reach out after the fact. But Eric, are there any questions in the Q&A?
Oh, Rachel, thank you very much. That was an awesome presentation, technical issues notwithstanding, but I bet your kittens are scheming in the background for that. We have a couple of questions that have popped up in the chat, so I'll go with the oldest one. And from an attendee, the question asks, when you say that you made it so admin files do not load unless the user is actually on administrative pages, what did you do to accomplish that?
That's a good question that I can't remember off the top of my head. So we used Flask for our front-end kind of MVC framework. And I can't remember if it was a built-in feature of Flask assets, but there was a way to check. You could do like if admin load the admin.min.js and the admin.min.css. So there was a conditional that we were able to put in there.
Okay, we have another question from the chat that asks, do you have any tool suggestions for finding and eliminating unused CSS? Smiley face.
Unfortunately, no. So I know that Chrome Developer Tools has a feature that can try to tell you what's not being used, but the problem is that it can't evaluate your entire website. It can only evaluate the page you're currently on. So I tried using that to get me started. And if I found something that maybe wasn't used on a certain page, I would go to several other pages and see if it was used there. But for the most part, I kind of just scrolled through my CSS and looked for things that I wasn't sure why they were there, or maybe I had like a ton of importance everywhere, which is usually an indication that something's gone wrong somewhere. And I kind of just tried to like trace things back and see where they were being used. And that's why we're not done yet, because it's a surprisingly manual process.
Awesome, thank you. There was another question in the chat asked from an attendee that asks, does Hummingbird interoperate with things like W3 total cache?
I'm not sure. So the site I'm using it on is actually hosted on WP Engine, and I know they do their own caching. So it does work with their caching, but I'm not sure how it works with other caching plugins that are out there.
Okay, great. We received another question in the chat from an audience member that asked, when you work on a full stack team with lots of separate roles, it is often hard to get buy-in from developers to implement such optimizations. Do you have any recommendations on how to get buy-in from all team members in order to get such optimizations implemented?
That is a good question. I like to try to, explain how their lives could be better, I guess, with more optimization, and also kind of talk about like the business case for it. I know at a university we're not talking about profit, but we might be talking about, how many people click through to learn about admissions and stuff like that. And I think that I think it was Francesca yesterday shared some data on like how much bounce rates increase as page load times go above 3 seconds. And I don't know that data off the top of my head, but I think that could be a place to start. Just kind of demonstrating like, these are the facts about how people interact with the website when it's not optimized. And then also, if you're comfortable with it, you could maybe take the lead on those optimizations. Maybe you could, if you do code reviews on your team, you could take part in code reviews and maybe don't merge pull requests that are doing things that are going to make your performance worse. And I think there's also something I want to look into that I'm not 100% sure that it's possible or how it works, is I think that there are tools out there where you can like reject a pull request if like a score decreases. So if like a performance score decreases, maybe you could say, sorry, you can't merge that. You're making our site slower. And then also, I don't know whether trying to convince every person on your team is the right choice. I think the most important people to convince are the people in charge of making the decisions. So if the manager of your team is on board, they probably have strategies for how to get the other folks on your team on board as well.
Awesome. Thank you. Rachel, we received another question in the chat asking, what was the most difficult or time-consuming aspect or optimization did you find with this project? And as a side question, did you expect that to be the most time-consuming or difficult aspect?
It's a good question. Yes. So the most difficult aspect for me was that this app is deployed in AWS EC2 and RDS. And I have very little experience with AWS other than just using the build scripts that my colleagues have shared with me. And using Flask, I don't remember if it was using Flask assets or if it was using another library I had tried beforehand called Flask Digest. But one of those, I remember that I had to make some configuration changes to AWS as well as some changes in like our app initialization file, that like _init_.py, they were unexpected and I had no idea what I was doing. And I had to, I definitely collaborated with someone on our team who has more experience in AWS. It was challenging, and then I ended up kind of figuring it out without too much assistance. So I was really proud too. So it was not expected and definitely raised my confidence and was hard.
All right, we've got another question in the chat that asks, speaking of manual optimizations, a child theme would prevent theme updates from overriding those fixes, but how do you deal with plugin CSS and JavaScript optimization?
I think Hummingbird would deal with that, but I haven't tried it on a child theme.
Okay, we have 3 minutes left, so I invite anyone that has any additional questions to post in the Ask a Question tool. There is one additional question that was submitted, and the question is, it sounds like image optimizations were a big aspect of this project. Is the optimization designs intended to handle all best practices for uploaded images, or do image uploads have to take certain parameters into account when they upload?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think that the usual advice of uploading images that are the right size for your theme or the right size for your content still applies. So in my experience using Smush, they do their best to resize, or that plugin does its best to resize images to sizes that make sense and to responsive sizes if those don't already exist. And then there's also an option to, you can tell it that you want to resize images above a certain size to a certain maximum size. But I still think that it's probably like just relying on Smush for like uploading the right size image to begin with is probably not a good idea. So I think, yeah, definitely like still manually resizing your images before you upload is probably the best plan.
Great, thank you. We received one question in the chat from an attendee that asks, thoughts on SVGs?
That's kind of broad. I like them. I think they're good. It's good that they scale. I know that I don't think WordPress lets you upload SVGs, so you have to install a plugin. And then, of course, the more plugins you install, the more you have to worry about, are those plugins injecting code that I don't want? I think SVGs are good in the right hands. They're good when people know how to use them. There was a talk yesterday where someone demonstrated creating an SVG of a chart by hand that was accessible. So I thought that was a fantastic use case. I guess without more direction on that question, that's what I've got.
That's quite all right. Thank you. So, Rachel, we are about out of time. For any additional questions that pop up, I'd like to point folks to the WP Campus Slack to continue asking them. And Rachel, you're also welcome to use the Ask a Question tool on the website to help answer those questions and steer additional discussion. But Rachel, I'd like to thank you for your presentation today. You handled it with grace, and your presentation was fantastic and full of expertise, and it was amazing to hear what you've been working on. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you so much for all those questions. I'm so excited that everyone was so engaged in the presentation.